So last month we started to talk about elements of pitch, and this month we are going to continue to do so. So let's jump right in. Scale degree names. Musicians in conversation or in writing often refer to scale degrees by a set of traditional names rather than by numbers. The names are shown here. Notice that there are two names for 7 in minor, depending on whether it is raised. So our first scale degree is the tonic. Above that, degree 2, the supertonic. Degree 3, the mediant. Degree 4, the subdominant. Degree 5, the dominant. Degree 6, the submediant. In degree 7, we notice that if it's that flat inversion of 7 in the natural minor, it is the subtonic. Whereas if it's in major or in harmonic or melodic where it's been raised, we refer to that 7th scale degree as the leading tone. The origin of some of these names is illustrated here. Notice that the mediant lies halfway between the tonic and the dominant, while the submediant lies halfway between the tonic and the subdominant. Please now do checkpoint 2 before coming back. Continuing on, intervals. An interval is the measurement of the distance in pitch between two notes. A harmonic interval results if the notes are performed at the same time, whereas a melodic interval occurs when the notes are played successively, as we can see here. The method of measuring intervals is the same for both harmonic and melodic intervals. So here we have the harmonic interval of A to E and of F to A. Then we have the melodic intervals of E to A to F, and then F to A. There are two parts to any interval name: the numerical name and the modifier that precedes the numerical name. As in this example, the numerical name is a measurement of how far apart the notes are vertically on the staff, regardless of what accidentals are involved. So when they're on the same line, it's a 1 or same space. 2 is 2 adjoining lines or spaces. So we see that there, C and D. A third is 1 space to the next space or 1 line to the next line. A fourth is a little bit further apart as well. In talking about intervals, we use the terms unison instead of 1 and octave or an 8VE instead of 8. We also say second instead of 2 and third instead of 3 and so on. Intervals smaller than an octave are called simple intervals, whereas larger intervals, including the octave, are called compound intervals. It is important to notice that in this example that the harmonic interval of a second is notated with the top note offset a little bit to the right of the bottom note. Accidentals are offset in the same way for harmonic intervals of a second, third, or fourth if both of them require an accidental. Please take a break and do questions 1-4. Continuing on, perfect, major, and minor intervals. One way to begin learning the modifiers for intervals is by relating them to the intervals contained in the major scale, specifically the intervals from 1 up to the other scale degrees. This method can then be applied in any context, whether or not the major scale is actually being used. The term perfect, which we abbreviate with a P, is a modifier used only in connection with unisons, fourths, fifths, octaves, and their compounds, such as elevenths, and so on. In this example, a perfect first, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect octave can all be constructed by using 1 in the major scale as the bottom note. If we want to spell one of these intervals above E flat, for example, we need only to think of scale steps 1, 4, and 5 of the E flat major scale. If the bottom note does not commonly serve as a first scale degree of a major scale, such as a D sharp, remove that accidental temporarily, spell the interval, and then apply the accidentals to both sides, as we can see here. So, if we start with our D sharp, and we want a perfect fifth above, if we think of D, we know that a perfect fifth above D would be A, so therefore, a perfect fifth above D sharp would be A sharp. The modifiers major and minor are used only in connection with seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. The intervals formed by scale degree 1 to 2, scale degree 1 to 3, scale degree 1 to 6, and scale degree 1 to 7 in the major scale are all major intervals, as we can see here. So 1 to 2 is a major second, 1 to 3 is a major third, 1 to 6 is a major sixth, 1 to 7 is a major 7 in the major scale. If a major interval is made a half step smaller without altering its numerical name, it becomes a minor interval. Notice that you can make an interval smaller by lowering the top note or raising the bottom note. So here we have G to A being a major second, and then G to A flat being a minor second. F to A being a major third, F sharp to A being a minor third. We can see those all right here. Now, please take a moment to complete questions 1-5. Continuing on, augmented and diminished intervals. If a perfect or a major interval is made a half step larger without changing the numerical name, the interval becomes augmented, which we abbreviate with a plus sign. If a perfect or a minor interval is made a half step smaller without changing its numerical name, it becomes diminished, abbreviated with like a degree symbol. The relationships are summarized here. So, if you have a major interval that gets raised, it becomes augmented. If you have a major interval that gets made smaller, it becomes minor. If you have a minor interval that becomes bigger, it becomes major. If you have a minor interval that becomes smaller, it becomes diminished. Perfect intervals can only become augmented or diminished. They cannot be major or minor. So if you raise a perfect interval, it's augmented, and if you lower a perfect interval, it is diminished. Also, if you lower an augmented interval, it becomes major if it's a 2, 3, 6, or 7. There is no such thing as a diminished unison. Doubly augmented and doubly diminished intervals are possible, but they seldom occur. Tritone is a term used for the augmented fourth or its enharmonic equivalent, the diminished fifth, The tritone is said to be one of the most unstable sounds in music, and it has been linked to the devil in history. What do you think? Inversion of intervals. Descending intervals, especially large ones, are often easier to spell and identify through the use of interval inversion. We invert an interval by putting the bottom pitch above the top one. For example, the interval D to A inverts to A to D. When we invert an interval, the new numerical name is always different from the old one. The new numerical name can be calculated by subtracting the old numerical name from 9. So, we can see here that if we take 9 and the old numerical name was a second, we remove that, and now it becomes a seventh. 9 minus a third is a sixth, so the interval inversion for 3 is 6. Our interval inversion for 4 is 5, and then it's the reverse for all those. 5 becomes 4, 6 becomes 3, and 7 becomes 2. You can see that an inverted second becomes a seventh, and a third becomes a sixth, and so on in this example as well. The modifier also changes when an interval is inverted, with the exception of perfect intervals. So, if the first interval was minor, the next interval would be major, or the inverted interval would be major. Vice versa is the same. If the first interval was major, the inversion is minor. Perfect stays the same. Augmented becomes diminished. Diminished becomes augmented. As an example of the usefulness of inversion, suppose you want to know what note lies a minor sixth above G3. Invert the minor sixth down to a major third up. As we can see here in this example, we transpose the B3 down the octave, and you'll find a B2 is the answer. Fluency with intervals, as with scales, is necessary for any serious musician and will provide a solid foundation for your further study. As you did with scales, you will benefit from finding out how various intervals sound and feel on a musical instrument. One exercise you can do, or that you can think of others, of course, is to write out the notes of the chromatic scale in random order. Include each black key twice, once as a sharp note and once as a flat note. Then play some interval above and below each note. Work for speed, using your ear to correct yourself. Consonant and dissonant intervals. In tonal music, some harmonic intervals are considered to be consonant, whereas others are considered to be dissonant. The terms consonant and dissonant can be defined roughly as meaning pleasing to the ear and not pleasing to the ear, respectively, but these are very dependent on context. Some of the most exciting moments in tonal music involve dissonance, which is certainly not displeasing in that context, but the dissonance resolves eventually to the consonants that give them meaning. If you can imagine, this is a complex subject, and it is one with which much study we will do later on. For now, it will suffice to say that major and minor thirds and sixths and perfect fifths and eighths are consonant. All other intervals are dissonant, except for the perfect fourth, which is dissonant only when it occurs above the lowest note, also called the bass, even in instrumental music. Please take a moment to do checkpoint 3, and when you are finished checkpoint 3, complete questions 1-6. Continuing on. Summary. Pitch in music refers to the highness or lowness of a sound. Particular pitches are named by using the musical alphabet, consisting of the letters A through G, at which point the alphabet starts over. From one letter up or down to its next occurrence is called an octave, whereas the space from any C up to the next B is called an octave register. Octave registers are numbered, with the lowest C on the piano keyboard designated as 1. The C nearest the middle of the piano keyboard is called middle C or C4. Pitches are notated on the staff, an arrangement of 5 lines and 4 spaces that can be extended through the use of ledger lines. A staff always begins with one of several clefs, which determine exactly what pitch is represented by each line or space. A grand staff consists of 2 staves joined by a brace, with a treble clef on the top staff and a bass clef on the bottom. A major scale consists of 2 identical tetrachords that have a particular arrangement of whole steps and half steps. Most major scales also have a parallel minor scale that begins on the same note, but that lowers scales degrees 3, 6, and 7 by a half step. This form of the minor is called the natural minor scale. The harmonic minor scale lowers only scale degree 3 and 6 of its parallel major, whereas the melodic minor scale lowers scale degree 3 when ascending and scale degrees 3, 6, and 7 when descending. Every scale has an associated key signature consisting of 0 to 7 sharps or flats arranged in a particular way on the staff. There are 15 key signatures in all, with 1 major and 1 minor scale associated with each. Major and minor keys that share the same key signature are said to be relative keys, whereas those that share the same starting note are said to be parallel keys. The notes of a scale are all assigned scale degree names, which vary only slightly between major and minor. Enharmonic notes or keys sound the same but are spelled differently. To transpose music means to play it in another key. The difference between any 2 pitches is called an interval. A harmonic interval separates pitches and are sounded simultaneously, whereas a melodic interval separates pitches that are sounded in succession. Intervals are defined by means of a numerical name and a modifier that precedes it. These modifiers include the terms perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. To invert an interval, put the lower note above the upper one, or the reverse. The numerical name and modifier of an inverted interval can be predicted using the method explained, where minor becomes major, diminished becomes augmented, and perfect stays the same. Also, you subtract the original interval from 9 to get the new interval. Consonant intervals include major and minor thirds and sixths, the perfect fifth, and the perfect eighth, or octave. The perfect fourth is usually consonant unless it occurs above the lowest voice.